Grab a Bible and turn with me to the book of 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, and we're not going to study this text. In fact, we're not even doing a Bible study. Again, you'll see why here in a moment. But I do want to read this passage as we come back to it and spend some time. And I'd like to read verses 7 through 10. And you'll see why as we get to the end why this passage is in view. So 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. This is the Apostle Paul writing to us. Because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, which, by the way, he just got done talking about, a man that he knew, quote unquote, maybe most likely Paul's talking about himself there, who had these astounding revelations and visions. Because of the greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Now, look at that phrase closely. Power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I have found, like I'm sure all of you have at some point, there are days, weeks, maybe I just should use the term seasons of life when your soul, your spiritual life can feel dry. Even if you're still doing the stuff you're supposed to do, praying, reading your Bible, you know, going to church, doing those things. But when you sing, it doesn't, you know, it's just not quite the same, and you can get in what I sometimes call a spiritual funk, and your soul just feels that way. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but I'll admit, I have seasons like that from time to time, where I'm still doing what I'm doing, not because of a sin thing, my spiritual life doesn't feel as fresh and vibrant and alive and like I want it to be. And I have discovered over the years one antidote, one prescription that works for me, maybe it doesn't work for you, but that works for me anytime that happens. And that is reading a good Christian biography. Reading about the lives of other saints, their trials, their struggles, their victories, their challenges. I find that it challenges me to realize, boy, I'm not alone, to see what could be, and it always seems to sort of get me out of that slump and that dryness of my own spiritual life. And so for the next 3 weeks, that's what I want to do, is talk about some Christian biographies. And specifically, I'm going to narrow it a little bit more. I'm going to talk about 3 missionaries and their biographies, their life, their ministries. You've probably heard of tonight's, but maybe don't know the whole story. I almost guarantee you don't know the next 2 weeks that we're going to talk about, but they're still some of the most fascinating stories that you've never heard. So you'll have to stay tuned for who that is when we talk about it. So when we think of inspiring missionaries, chances are we think of individuals' names like Adoniram Judson. Anybody know where he went? Burma, actually, yes. There was Jim Elliot, who went to Ecuador. And then there is also William Carey, who went to, there you go, India. All right. So when you think about great missionaries of the past, right? If there was a Hall of Fame of missionaries, right? Those 3 names would be some of the premier sort of spotlights of it, right? We think about some of the things they did and the works and the difference that it made. So Adoniram Judson and William Carey and Jim Elliot would inspire us. But have you ever stopped to wonder who inspired them? We read their lives and see the impact they made. William Carey is considered the father of modern missions, right? But who are the people that they looked to, right, that sparked them? Interestingly, all three of those men, William Carey, Adoniram Judson, and Jim Elliot, cite the same person as the inspiration for them going into the mission field. And it was a man by the name of David Brainerd. Yep. Who's familiar? I've seen a couple of heads shake. A few of you know the name. I don't know how much you know of his story. It's a fascinating story, and I suspect you're going to learn maybe a few things that you didn't know along the way. William Carey ranked David Brainerd among one of the greatest missionaries of all time. In fact, he wrote one time, quote, "The Scriptures teach us to lay up treasures in heaven. What a treasure must await such men as the Apostle Paul and David Brainerd." So he put those two men side by side when he talked about the greatest he'd ever known. Historians call, as I said, William Carey the father of modern missions. That makes David Brainerd the grandfather of modern missions. What's so interesting is David Brainerd was an unlikely missionary hero because Brainerd was a very unlikely missionary. There is no indication when you look at his life, especially early on, that he would amount to much of anything, let alone to become what he did in ministry. When you look at, like Charles Spurgeon, you may or may not know, his father was actually a minister. His grandfather was a minister. He read Pilgrim's Progress from the time he was 5 years old, every year, right? Read Puritans as a child, right? He was kind of groomed for it, right? It would almost been a disappointment if Spurgeon hadn't gone into the ministry, right? But when you look at David Brainerd's life, there's a few connections, but not nearly the kind of upbringing or pedigree that you might suspect. He was too young by most people's standards to be much of a missionary. He was single, and so wasn't considered by some as being appropriate for the mission field. He had zero experience in terms of preaching and any kind of formal church work. He had chronic health problems his entire life. And so when you just took those few things, it's easy to see that he would have had today a difficult time. Even in his normal conversation, he spent most of his days coughing and hacking, trying to just breathe normally from sicknesses he'd had as a child that so badly affected him physically. Furthermore, when he, as you'll hear in a moment, as he went to college, he earned a reputation as a rabble-rouser. David Brainerd actually defied the university's policy, and I'll tell you the story in a moment, and was expelled from college while he was there. So this is the great missionary hero. No wife, right? Very little money, right? No college degree, right? Very poor health. All the odds are stacked to get him, and yet he's the man that all these men point to. I think it's safe to say if he were applying to the IMB today, he would stand a very little chance to be commissioned and sent. Brainerd may have looked like a pebble among rocks spiritually, but he was the size, spiritually, he was the size of Mount Everest. He was a man of deep, deep prayer. And I wish I had time to talk about that. I really don't for what it deserves. But truly, this seems to be, most people say, the secret to David Brainerd's life. That he would spend hours of his day, sometimes entire days in prayer, dedicating himself and fasting for the things that he was seeking God. And he knew himself to be weak, physically weak. He knew himself to be, again, in terms professionally weak, and yet he knew that God was strong, and it was through this that he changed the world. David Brainerd was born before the United States was even born. April 20th, 1718, in a small colonial town in Connecticut, New England. There we go. He was the third of 9 children in the Brainerd family. His father, Hezekiah Brainerd, was a justice of the peace for the King of England, so had a little bit of stature in the work that he did. His mother was named Dorothy. His grandfather, his maternal grandfather, was a minister in a little town called Haddam. Hold on, let me get this right. Yes, Haddam, Connecticut. And if you go today to Haddam, Connecticut, as one of the founders of the village, Daniel Brainerd's name is listed as having been one of the first men to settle this little place.
Maternal grandfather or paternal?
I'm sorry, whichever I said. His mother's dad.
No.
Maternal.
Yeah, if it's her maiden name, which would not be Brainerd.
I'm sorry? Oh, okay, yes. Forgive me then. It was his paternal. Yes, okay. Sorry. Anyhow, so his grandfather was a minister in this little town of Haddam, Connecticut, and the story goes that he was pastoring his church at the age of 85. He preached the morning service. He went home for lunch. He laid down after his prayers to have a nap for the evening service, and he just never woke up. And so his grandfather passed away while still being the pastor. But that was not the last time that David would experience loss of one of his relatives. His father died when he was 9 years old. His mother died when he was just 14. And so David Brainerd grew up with a very real sense of the frailty of life, of heaven and hell, of the reality that people will die at some point. Furthermore, as a child, he contracted tuberculosis, hence the breathing issues that he had most of his life. He records in his journals about how, while preaching, as we will see in a few moments, that he would have to stop in the middle of his sermons to basically cough up blood clots because his lungs were so bad, and yet he was not deterred to keep doing what he did. But he knew how fragile and how uncertain life was, and yet he committed himself to this. After his mother passed away, he moved in with one of his older sisters and lived with her for a few years and inherited a family farm when he was 19. But Brainerd decided that he hated farming and wanted nothing to do with farming. And instead of rows of corn, he preferred rows of desks and decided he was going to sell it all and then go to college so that he could do something and learn and grow. What's interesting is, during this time, Brainerd talked about his religious devotion, but he described it as just outward piety of reading his Bible, chapters a day, praying, like what as best he knew how, and yet described how he knew that he didn't know God, and that he was just doing what other people did because it was upstanding and it appeared to be religious. But he wanted to know God, but he didn't know how, so he continued to do the things that he did. But he thought, well, if I go to Yale, then maybe I can get into college and grow and learn some things. And as he was preparing to go to school, on July 12th, 1739, he was describing a moment of darkness that weighed upon him. This is from his journals. He said, "Here in my mournful and melancholy state, I was attempting to pray, but my religious affections were all gone. I thought the Spirit of God would never come to me, when suddenly unspeakable glory seemed to open to the view and the apprehension of my soul. I do not mean an external brightness, for I saw no such thing, but my soul rejoiced with joy unspeakable. My soul was captivated and delighted with the excellency, the loveliness, the greatness, and the other perfections of God, that I felt as though I had been swallowed up in Him." And he goes on to talk about how he went from being dead spiritually to being alive spiritually. And God had done a work in him, and faith was alive in him, and he knew that something had transformed him and that he had been changed. And so he committed his life then to serving the Lord and pursuing gospel ministry, whatever that meant. And so Brainerd was enrolling in school, and at this point he was 21 years of age. So he went to Yale thinking, I'll study for the ministry, which, by the way, that's where you went to school back then, to study for the ministry, was you went to Yale. And he thought, for sure, Yale is going to build me up. But he found just the opposite, that it tore him down. At this time, if you know anything about history, the Great Awakening had been happening. There's two movements of the Great Awakening. The first Great Awakening was finished, and at this point, when he's going to Yale, that's when George Whitefield is actually making his way to America to begin what's the sort of second part of the Great Awakening. And the impact of the Great Awakening was particularly on young people, teenagers, 20-year-olds, right? The college students, if you will. And so it was spreading like wildfire through New England, and many of those students were enrolled at, guess where? At Yale. And so on the campus of Yale, there were like spontaneous Bible studies breaking out. There were all-night prayer meetings taking place that were all student-led, and just the overflow of God's work among the student body there at Yale. And the school year was about to begin, and the faculty weren't all too pleased by this because they felt it was disruptive to some of the academic pursuits of the school, and it was all religious fervor and fanaticism, all of this talk of, being born again and so on and so forth. So the faculty at Yale decided to get together, and they began to consider the situation. Many of the students thought that the faculty was lost, and the professors thought the students were crazy. So in 1741, the administration of Yale passed a policy. This is the actual policy. Quote, "If any student of this college directly or indirectly says that the rector or professors of the university are hypocrites, carnal, or unconverted men, he shall for the first offense make a public confession in the hall in front of the students, and for the second offense be expelled." So if you dare say that one of the professors is not truly a believer, right, that they're not unconverted, right? So the faculty was ready for war between this divide within the school. So the administration on the opening day of of school, they drafted the policy and handed it out, and they decided that they were going to try to prove their point, kind of make a statement with the policy. So they invited a guest preacher to the chapel service that day who was an alumni, and they thought for sure he would help them, and it was none other than Jonathan Edwards. True story. Jonathan Edwards preached a sermon from 1 John chapter 4, and it was called "The Marks of the Work of God's Spirit." And he laid out, I think it was 4 or 5 ways to know that God's Spirit is actually at work among a person or a group. And he preached the sermon, and the students just loved it because he was clearly on their side of this issue, and the faculty was furious at him for what he had done. And so the battle lines were drawn. The students had Edwards on their side. The faculty had expulsion on their side. And so this was the face-off. So who was the first casualty of this on-campus war? It was David Brainerd. The story has said that in a private conversation, Brainerd was talking to a friend, and this is the actual quote, that he told this freshman that such and such, a certain professor, quote, had about as much of the grace of God as a chair. So the freshman ratted on David Brainerd that he had said this thing, and so Brainerd was brought before the student body to apologize, and he refused, so they expelled him. Now, for years, Brainerd, by the way, he was at the top of his class. He'd already been at school 1 year, if I remember correctly, so he was already like one of their elite premier students, and yet they cut him out. Brainerd, by the way, battled deep depression over this, over what happened at the school for years. He made several appeals. He came back willing to apologize, but they refused to reinstate him, and so he was never able to graduate or to get his degree from Yale, even though he had completed most of it. But his time at Yale was not wasted, because in the previous semester, he had heard a preacher that had came to chapel, a man by the name of Ebenezer Pemberton, which sounds like a name from a Dickens book, Ebenezer Pemberton, who preached in chapel. And he pleaded with the students that if you feel God's called to ministry and you want to make a difference where no difference is being made, come to the unreached people group next door and go help convert the American Indians. And David Brainerd heard this call and remembered this and thought, surely God could use him to do that. So Brainerd sought out, after he was expelled, Pemberton, and he spent some time with him, and he saw the young man's devotion and love for Christ and his fervor, and so he had 2 churches that sponsored him, and they sent him to New York for training. And so at the age of 24, Brainerd became a missionary to the Native American Indians in New York. So think about that. First of all, he got saved at 21. He's now a missionary at 24. Right? How unlikely is that? Right? Like by our standards and thoughts today, right? And yet they saw something in him that was incredible. So he was looking for great success among the Indians in New York, but all he found at first was failure. Brainerd was so impatient to evangelize the Indians that he decided, he made little effort to learn the language. He was convinced that the Bible alone would make the difference. And so he preached oftentimes without an interpreter, and as you can imagine, the Indians just walked away and didn't listen to him initially. But David Brainerd, he felt how miserable and fruitless this ministry was at first, some of it due to his own impatience, and he began to feel this deep depression. In one entry of his journal, he wrote about how melancholy he was, that he couldn't get out of bed the entire day. He said, quote, "My heart is sunken within me. It seems to me that I should never have any success among the Indians. My soul is weary of my life. I long for death beyond measure." If you read Brainerd's journals, he 22 times cites wanting to die because he's so miserable and so tossed about in his soul and his circumstances and how terrible this is. I said this in a sermon a couple of Sundays ago. Some of you may remember it. You know, the idea that godly people can't be depressed or that a true Christian can't be depressed is just ludicrous. Clearly, here was a man that loved God and knew God and was pursuing God, even in the midst of his sorrow and his sadness. His living conditions, though, were particularly hard. Here's how he described his housing. He said, "I live in a most lonely desert. I board with an old Scotsman whose wife doesn't speak English. My diet consists of hasty pudding, boiled corn, and bread baked in ashes. My bed is a heap of straw on some boards upon the ground. My work here is exceedingly hard and difficult." And he suffered from severe isolation and loneliness, feeling as if he had no Christians around him and no one to talk to among Indians who didn't speak the language and felt so cut off from everyone. And the only one he had was God. And so it drove Brainerd deeper into his prayer closet to spend more time in prayer and to seek God through these seasons. And so Brainerd wrote, for instance, about one of his times. It says, "Lord's Day, April 25th. This morning I spent 2 hours in secret prayer and was enabled more than ordinarily to agonize for immortal souls. Though it was early in the morning and the sun scarcely shined at all, my body was quite wet with sweat." So he prayed so hard and was so fervent that he was sweating in his prayer time. So he spent 2 years in New York witnessing to the Indians, and not a single convert. Nobody listened to him. Miserable, miserable time. Despite this, Brainerd was not willing to give up yet. So he went back to Pennsylvania for a time, and then eventually went to Delaware. And it was in Delaware that Brainerd would finally begin to see the fruit of his labors. In Delaware, he found a new Indian settlement to work with. And I read earlier, and I forget which Indian, I recognize it, but I can't remember now. He hastily built himself a crude shelter on the outskirts of this Indian village. And Brainerd had decided that the next morning he would go to the chief and tell him who he was and why he was there. Which, by the way, that was an interesting thing. It wasn't like, hey, I'm just going to spend some time and get to know these people. He would go straight to the chief and be like, "I want to tell you about Jesus. Can I tell you about Jesus?" And like, most of the time they'd say yes, even though, again, at first, but he was very direct in his efforts. But on this particular occasion, he made plans to enter the village the next morning, and so Brainerd committed himself to prayer that evening. And so he spent the rest of that afternoon and the whole evening in prayer on his knees. Little did he know that the local Indians were watching him from a distance. From the bushes surrounding his shack, they were waiting and watching this man who had built on the outskirts. They later reported that they had gathered to kill Brainerd for encroaching near their property. And what happened next can only be called a miracle. One biographer described what happened as this. He said, quote, "When the braves, the Indians, drew close to Brainerd's tent, they saw him on his knees. As he prayed, they reportedly said a rattlesnake slipped into the tent, lifted its head to strike Brainerd, the man, and without any apparent reason turned and slithered away. And the Indians, being, superstitious and having thoughts about animals and meanings, said to one another, "The Great Spirit is with this man." And so they assumed he must be a prophet. And so they welcomed him the next morning to listen to the message that he had to preach. While he was there, he did this time get an interpreter. And the story was said that Brainerd began preaching to this tribe of Indians, and a few people were there. And as he was preaching, his interpreter started sobbing uncontrollably because he was coming under conviction by the sermon that Brainerd was preaching. And they had to keep stopping for this man to get his composure for him. And the man said that he was converted while he was interpreting for Brainerd. While that was happening, the interpreter's wife fell under conviction and started weeping uncontrollably. And she too came to faith in Christ while her husband was interpreting for Brainerd and he was preaching. During that entire time, that first day, 47 Indians came to faith in Christ, and Brainerd baptized them right there on the spot. On a short time later, on December 29th, Brainerd tells that he had finished preaching a morning service with those that had gathered, and he came home for a time of prayer. He said, "I never got the chance to pray that Lord's Day afternoon." He said, this is in his journal. "The Indians soon came into my tent, to my shack, one after another, with tears in their eyes, and they kept asking me, 'What must I do to be saved?' It was an outpouring of the Spirit of God like I have never seen before, as if the heavens themselves had bowed down in my very midst, and that I felt as though God was going to convert the whole world, no matter what I said." In just a brief period, Brainerd on that day led 130 Indians to faith in Christ. He baptized them, and they established a church out of the work that was happening there. During this time, Brainerd also helped establish a school to educate the Indian children and to teach them some basic education. And despite his initial resistance, Brainerd ended up learning the Indian language, and as a result translated the entire book of Psalms into their tongue so they would have something to read. Now here's the kicker. You ready for this? David Brainerd started his ministry at 24, and he died at 29. Just 5 years and all of that. As he became increasingly ill towards the end of his life, Brainerd was invited to take a rest in the home of a man named Jonathan Dickens in New Jersey. So Brainerd had contracted his tuberculosis again, and he became incredibly ill. And so he went to Dickens's home for the winter. Not long afterwards, his health declined further, and so he finally made his way back to spend his final days with a man that he admired and looked to, a man he had met one time at Yale, a man named Jonathan Edwards. And it was in Jonathan Edwards' home that David Brainerd died. Edwards' 17-year-old daughter, Jerusha, nursed him and cared for him, and the two of them fell in love over the months that he was there. And while there, agreed that had he recovered, should he recover, they would marry, but he never recovered and died on October 9th, 1747, in Jonathan Edwards' home. Jerusha contracted tuberculosis from him, and she died just 5 months later on Valentine's Day, and the two of them are buried side by side there in Connecticut. Jonathan Edwards gathered up all of David Brainerd's journals and his writings and began compiling them. On his deathbed, he asked him, he was so impressed by this young man. Now, this was the man who led the First Great Awakening, who said, "The world needs to know about you." Had it not been for Jonathan Edwards in that sense, this story would have been lost to history. In fact, the journals of David Brainerd are the best-selling thing Jonathan Edwards ever wrote. And he's written a lot of things that a lot of people have read, and yet this was the thing that really stands out to this day. His book, by the way, The Life and Diary of David Brainerd, has never been out of print since the 1700s. John Wesley, who was greatly impacted once, said that the Life and Diary of David Brainerd is the most important book next to the Bible that I've ever read. You can find in the works of Adoniram Judson, Henry Martin, William Carey, Jim Elliot, Robert Moffat, David Livingston, Robert Murray McShane. There's a half a dozen or more spiritual giants who every one of them says it was the life and diary of David Brainerd, the man's private devotion to God, the man's commitment to prayer, the man's dedication to the lost, his love for fasting and God himself was the thing that transformed our understanding. So I commend to you the life and diary of David Brainerd, but just beware, God might turn you into a missionary after you read it, because it seems like everybody who reads it feels like God's calling them to the mission field. It's a dangerous book to read, so just be forewarned. There's one last note of David Brainerd's life that's noteworthy. Though he never got a college degree, David Brainerd had an unexpected impact on higher education as well. As a result of his expulsion from Yale, a faction of Presbyterians left the campus of Yale. Like, they cited this young man's expulsion as the reason they were leaving, and they started their own college to train men for gospel ministry. It was known initially as the College of New Jersey. Today it's known as Princeton. In fact, the first class that met for this college, guess where they met? In Jonathan Dickinson's home, while David Brainerd was in the room next door dying, essentially. They were having the first class of Princeton with Brainerd in the room next door. Additionally, there was a man named Eleazar Whitlock, another great name, who heard about the story of David Brainerd, and in 1748 founded and started a school dedicated to training Native American Indians in honor of David Brainerd, and today that school is known as Dartmouth College. Furthermore, even though Yale would not accept David Brainerd back into enrollment, the school did not forget him, because today, if you take divinity classes at Yale, you will take them in Brainerd Hall, the only building named after a student expelled from the campus. So, listen again to the words of the Apostle Paul. For power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I would rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. I am content with insults, distresses, persecutions, and difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And I think that passage so speaks to the life of David Brainerd. And let's be honest, for all of us, right? Our weaknesses, we're embarrassed by them. We want to hide them, not admit them, run from them, our insecurities, those difficulties, and yet that's actually the very secret, it seems, to recognizing and humbling ourselves before God, right? God gives grace to the humble. And David Brainerd's life, I think, is a wonderful, wonderful picture of that.